When someone with anxious attachment reaches their absolute breaking point with avoidant behavior, something fundamental shifts inside them that permanently alters the relationship dynamic. This isn't another emotional outburst or desperate plea for connection. This is psychological transformation where their tolerance for inconsistent love finally snaps, and they become someone the avoidant doesn't recognize. The anxious person who once chased, accommodated, and absorbed emotional cruelty suddenly becomes unreachable in ways that terrify the avoidant more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. The silent rage replaces desperate pursuit. When anxious partners finally snap, their frantic pursuit transforms into cold, silent rage that's far more devastating than their previous emotional reactions. Instead of chasing harder when the avoidant withdraws, they stop chasing entirely and retreat into protective fury that creates impenetrable emotional distance. This silent rage is terrifying to avoidants because they're used to anxious reactions they can dismiss as too emotional or needy. When their partner becomes quietly enraged, instead of desperately pursuing, they lose their ability to feel superior or in control of the dynamic. The transformation from anxious pursuit to silent rage eliminates the avoidant's power to regulate the relationship through emotional withdrawal. Suddenly, their hot-cold tactics don't create the desperate chase they're used to, but rather cold indifference that feels threatening and unfamiliar. They develop laser-focused clarity about the patterns. The snap moment brings crystal-clear understanding of every manipulation tactic, every excuse, and every way the avoidant has been using their anxiety against them. They suddenly see the relationship with devastating accuracy that cuts through all emotional confusion and desperate hope. This clarity includes recognition of how their own behavior enabled the avoidance patterns, and how their pursuit actually reinforced the very dynamics that caused them pain. They understand with perfect precision how they've been participating in their own emotional abuse. The newfound clarity eliminates their ability to make excuses for the avoidance behavior or blame themselves for the relationship problems. They can see clearly who chose what and who's responsible for which patterns, making gaslighting and manipulation impossible. Their standards become non-negotiable. When anxious partners snap, they develop rigid standards for treatment that weren't present during their accommodation phase. They stop accepting breadcrumbs, stop tolerating inconsistency, and start requiring genuine reciprocity rather than hoping for eventual change. These standards aren't delivered through ultimatums or emotional demands, but through quiet implementation of boundaries that weren't previously enforced. They stop accepting behavior they once rationalized and start requiring treatment they once thought they didn't deserve. The shift to non-negotiable standards creates panic in avoidants who were comfortable with the previous dynamic, where they could provide minimal effort and receive maximum accommodation from their anxious partner. They stop providing emotional regulation. The snapped anxious partner withdraws all the emotional support, understanding, and regulation they were providing, while the avoidant took their availability for granted. This sudden cessation of emotional labor creates immediate crisis for avoidants who didn't realize how much they depended on this support. This withdrawal includes no longer managing the avoidant's emotions, no longer providing comfort during their struggles, and no longer offering the patience and understanding that allowed the avoidant to function without developing their own emotional skills. The removal of emotional support forces avoidants to confront how much they were actually depending on their anxious partner for psychological stability while believing they were maintaining independence. They become immune to manipulation tactics. Once snapped, anxious partners develop supernatural resistance to the very tactics that once controlled them completely. Love bombing doesn't work. Future promises feel empty, and intermittent reinforcement creates disgust rather than hope. This immunity develops because they finally experienced enough pain to override their attachment system's desperate need for connection. They choose self-protection over hope for the first time in the relationship. The immunity to manipulation is particularly devastating to avoidants because it removes their primary tools for managing the relationship dynamic and maintaining control over their partner's emotional investment. They grieve the relationship while still in it. Snapped, anxious partners often begin grieving the relationship and their partner while still physically present, treating the avoidant like someone who's already dead to them emotionally. This premature grieving creates eerie emotional distance that feels final rather than strategic. This grief process includes accepting that the person they loved doesn't really exist and that the relationship they wanted isn't possible with this particular person. They mourn their hopes and illusions while preparing for inevitable separation. The grieving while present is terrifying to avoidants because it suggests their partner has already moved beyond trying to save the relationship and has begun accepting its death as inevitable. They start planning their exit. When anxious partners snap, they shift from trying to fix the relationship to planning their escape from it. This planning is methodical and practical rather than emotional and reactive, including financial preparation, living arrangements, and emotional readiness for separation. The exit planning is done quietly and systematically while maintaining normal relationship function, creating a surreal dynamic where they appear present but are actually preparing for departure, the point of no return. The most terrifying aspect of the anxious partner's snap is that it often represents a point of no return, where they've moved beyond caring about the avoidant's potential for change or the relationship's potential for healing. When the anxious partner finally snaps, they transform from someone desperate to save the relationship into someone methodically planning to end it, creating the very abandonment the avoidance patterns were designed to avoid, but ultimately guaranteed through their emotional cruelty and consistent unavailability.